The CIA killed your mom. No, not really, but they totally would for national security. That's crazy, and more importantly brings me on to my next point. National security. Security of the nation. What is that? Well, in short, no one really knows. It sort of just depends on what the government feels like it means that day. Thanks. Please like and subscribe. Okay, well, I guess there is some information I could provide if you held a gun to my head, which may be the case after this video drops. To begin, national security is a very American idea, first and foremost. Dictators aren't traditionally known for assigning fancy political terms to their actions beyond adding a democratic or People's Republic in their nation's names. Dictators sort of just do the things they want and call it governing. That's too simple for even us Americans. Unlike our surface-level performance-based politics, we as a shadow government love espionage, wet work, and, more importantly, gathering domestic-based counterintelligence. National security, that little golden ticket I mentioned earlier, gives the government a somewhat moral backing to do pretty much anything they deem necessary. You see, the King in Black, the alphabet mafia Capone, the CIA, is still made up of people, human people who probably want to do good with their lives, have families, and keep the world safe for their newly had families. At least, the American world. Seeing as humans feel things, despite it be probably better if we didn't, it's hard to get behind inherently bad or morally questionable situations. Doesn't take a genius to tell you that. Nobody really wanted to be called a Nazi after 1942, and it wasn't just because they were the quote-unquote bad guys to the Allies who had won the war. Back to national security. It's pretty much anything involving the safety of the American people and ongoings of the status quo. This is a broad term, kept so deliberately. You could dive down a conspiracy on how national security is kept so broad that it takes away the rights of the American people on premise alone. For example, if someone, a journalist, had information that the United States was using a legion of mole people working as slaves, national security would dictate that the CIA gets to work and make sure that person, the journalist, doesn't say anything about the mole people slaves. More reasonably, you find out about a certain conspiracy diverting mass government funds for unethical projects, or something like that. The CIA can be assumed to give you a government-funded execution in the form of two 10mm 8-cent lead projectiles. Pretty much anything that would cause the United States to crumble, even scandals, fall under national security. This is a double-edged sword. You can't really be against domestic terrorism without some length of what we call national security becoming involved. Or at least, that's what the propaganda is telling me. The Central Intelligence Agency has been known to use this principle of national security a bit liberally in the past, however. The CIA has been doing sketchy ops since they first popped up in 1947, from well-known scandals of MKUltra to Bloodstone. However, it's with the global spread of information and the internet that we as a species have turned into meerkats, alerting others of potential wrongs in the world near instantaneously. It also doesn't hurt we all have supercomputers in our pockets that would literally melt the face off anyone back in 1947 if you showed them TikTok for 15 minutes. All this to say, we've gotten pretty good about exposing some rather fucked up stuff the United States government's been caught up in. Without further context, my name's Gideon. Let's talk about why the CIA would totally kill your mom and some of the other not so cool things they have done. When writing this video, I wasn't sure where I was headed, but finalizing the script will give a brief history of the US involvement in South America and the Middle East. Our story starts following the largest organized terrorist attack ever committed on American soil, also known as 9/11. At the time, current President George W. Bush pulled a Reagan and announced the official declaration of America's war on terror. If you're growing up as a youth during this time, it was a really interesting period because America had a very unique identity developing. I like to call it Hummer America because the Hummer vehicle sort of took off at an all-time high following 9/11. And with its 10 mpg gas mileage, it really stood for what we were: big, consumptuous, and making an impact to the planet. Becoming more militarized than ever, this wasn't like Vietnam, where Americans were being forced overseas to fight supposed communists. America had been attacked, and in the following year more Americans would enlist in the military than any other year to date. The United States would also increase the military budget an additional 50% from its current state. So, who was our enemy? Well, the figurehead of a group named Al-Qaeda, a man by the name of Osama bin Laden, sometimes spelled with a U, had been accredited with organizing the hijacking of 4 airliners and the destruction of the World Trade Centers. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and the US once shared a common enemy as the expanding Soviet Union was beginning to encroach on the Middle East, something both groups weren't incredibly fond of. After a series of conflicts, revolutions, coups, and just regime meddling in general, Al-Qaeda would turn its sights on the US for sticking its hand in Middle Eastern affairs as much as the Soviet Union, if not more, following the end of the Cold War. In 1992, a hotel bombing would occur in Yemen, where US troops had been staying in transit to Somalia. It wasn't that bizarre at the time. The bomb could have been pretty much placed by anyone, and the bomb went off long after they had left. However, they were suspicious that Al-Qaeda may be changing their target, and this attack would be claimed by bin Laden in 1998, years later. The target change would be apparent when in February of 1993, Al-Qaeda would commit a bombing on the very same trade towers of 9/11, killing 6 and injuring 1,000. In 1994, the Taliban would make their way onto the scene. A brief history lesson: Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are different. Al-Qaeda has global goals of fucking with America and the West. The Taliban is like the equivalent of a more successful US Confederacy, minus the slavery and wanting to take only a piece of the country. The Taliban want the whole thing. Prior to 1994, the nation of Afghanistan was going through a little something called the Afghan Crisis, something accredited with the actions of the Soviets at the time. A nearly 20-year run of 3 to 7 groups infighting and creating civil wars after the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, leaving a power vacuum. The Taliban would then step up and seize the city capital of Kabul towards the end of the crisis, becoming the controlling party. While dominating, the Taliban promised Afghanistan prosperity under the group's rule. Most Afghanis, tired of the lifetime of fighting, accept the Taliban as the ruling party everywhere but in the north. The Taliban then proceeds to enforce radical Muslim ideologies, burning the infamous opium poppy fields and requiring women to dress in full traditional Muslim garb. Despite the Taliban having made promises of prosperity, climate change would affect millions that year, creating refugees who would attempt to find asylum in Pakistan. During this time, the Northern Alliance, led by Masood Khalil, an opposition group to the southern originating Taliban, began fighting back in attempts to retake Kabul. In the early 2000s, following a US embassy being bombed by Al-Qaeda, President Clinton requested expedition of Osama bin Laden. The Taliban, Afghanistan, disrespectfully declined to do so. This leads Clinton to declare Al-Qaeda a terrorist cell. Throughout the early 2000s, Al-Qaeda would continue to pull shenanigans and affronts the world by blowing up Buddhist statues and assassinating Masood, the Northern Alliance leader, by having a member posing as a journalist to get close. Then, in 2001, Al-Qaeda would commit one of the most heinous actions in American history, the September 11th World Trade Center attacks, where 4 airliners would be hijacked by 5-man teams. 2 would collide with the Twin Trade Towers in New York, New York. One of the planes would crash into the Pentagon, and the 4th and final plane would crash land in a Pennsylvania field, killing all on board. During the time, I was 2 and my family was in Mexico on vacation. I have little to no memory, but apparently it was very difficult to get back into the country. Imagine that. Following the attacks, the world goes apeshit on Afghanistan, and more specifically, the Taliban. America and its allies start carpet bombing the shit out of the Taliban strongholds, invading and occupying relentlessly, causing a Taliban retreat from Kabul only 60 days after the 9/11 attack. Spoiler alert, we'll do all this little dance for 20 years, and then dip out. But for now, from 2002 to 2004, the US continues to establish a firm hold on that sweet, sweet oil, freedom, and help them poor little Afghans set up a US-approved democracy. The Taliban is pushed further south, and the future is looking bright. In 2006, George W. Bush, back on the scene, has a heavy message for the US people. During this whole feel-good, beat-the-bad-guy moment, the US establishes the existence of black sites. What is a black site? Oh, nothing really. You shouldn't even worry about those. They're just these sort of secret government-operated prisons where trained enhanced interrogators can shove bamboo rods up pee-holes of suspected terrorists. Now, honestly, like most ideas on paper, black sites were pretty kosher, in my opinion, despite the bad name. The US legal system is infamously slow compared with terrorist organizations not having to cross bureaucratic red tape. And these terrorists can't be kept in Gen Pop anywhere in America, they'll get killed in a second. Even the Marvel villains don't fuck with Al-Qaeda. This creates a losing battle for the war on terror 99% of the time, hence black sites. Seeing as how the task required the utmost secrecy, the administration gave it to the agency with the best track record, indiscretion. That's right, the CIA. The world's a messed up place, and we can't always afford to play it nice, especially when airplanes are going into government buildings. So it's not the capture of suspected terrorists and then eventual quote-unquote information extraction from said terrorists that make black sites so controversial, to me at least. It's what happened after. Where did it all go wrong? What was the slip-up? Well, the CIA doesn't stay in its fucking lane, landing us in hot water over and over and over and over again. What I mean by that is not everyone's going to be on board for black sites. That's totally okay. What's not okay is setting up shop despite the people in the country rather have it not be there. And I'm not talking about the ones in Kabul, the heart of the action, but may I direct your attention to Poland. In 2003, 2 CIA agents arrived in Warsaw, over 4,000 kilometers away from Kabul, with $15 million. Their goal? Start a black site that wasn't in Cambodia or Thailand. Why neither of those places? Snakes. Even the CIA doesn't mess with snakes. CIA needed a long-term base where extensive interrogation methods could take place over a lengthy period of time. Poland was nice. It had an established base of operations ready to go. All the CIA needed was an inn. And that inn was money. After this whole situation came to light in a humanitarian investigation, both Poland and the US had no comment on the situation, denying accusations. In 2014, however, Poland would nut up and say, yeah, we had one. Fuck you. I was willing to give them a pass on Thailand and Cambodia until you really start to think about what the CIA noticed after a couple of weeks of operation. Let's cut back to the White House. The Bush administration was going out on a limb by establishing these black sites. The public would have questions, and Bush needed answers for this. This would require the CIA to send updates and reports on what was going on, down at each black site, just to mitigate some of the possible damage. I know what you're thinking. Oh no, they aren't going to send the reports. Well, that's where you're wrong. They were sending the reports, just falsified ones. Incredibly falsified ones. First and foremost, it was pretty quickly found out that torture doesn't work, at least physical, like waterboarding, #trademark. The person being tortured is more likely to confirm whatever bias you provide or just make something reasonable up so you stop drowning them. The CIA didn't like this revelation in human psychology, and so they straight up lied. Just went, yep, the torture is working wonders and we've got lots of good info we can't send you for national security, privileged information, all that. See how that works? Additionally, the CIA members at these black sites were found to be doing things like experimental torture methods that the US government couldn't, or honestly didn't, approve of, dodging oversight and creating roadblocks for when the Department of Justice came snooping around. Prisoners are also held years at a time, often making information, if any, extracted obsolete and outdated, even if at one point valuable. Ultimately, none of the interrogations led to information on Osama bin Laden, despite having prisoners who were involved directly in 9/11. In 2006, when Bush confirmed the existence of black sites, public outcry was enormous. Bush stated that the prisoners were not entitled to treatment based on the Geneva Convention, which makes sense, but were not having any of their Geneva Convention rights violated. This statement was followed up with a remark that most of the current black site prisoners will be transferred to Guantanamo Bay. In 2007, it would be discovered during an investigation that the CIA had destroyed a large portion of interrogation tapes for national security. How convenient. Guantanamo is still in operation to this day, and everyone seems to have just accepted the CIA will try and stick to this one location, most of the time. Who knows? It might be a national security threat that requires one in Paris or Chicago. Black sites aren't new news. I figured I would just give you my thoughts on them to start out this whole shebang. In short, I don't see what ripping out a fingernail in Kabul won't get you that ripping out 4 in Poland will. Waste of money and unnecessarily cruel compared to a simple execution. More importantly, the US willing to hold a trial for Osama bin Laden, but not the 173 people held in the same conditions as terrorists and released without charge in 2005, tells me that the Middle East and the rest of the world may have a point by saying these are human rights violations. Especially since the CIA destroyed these tapes most likely first. So how did these prisoners get here? Well, the US prints out these pamphlets with a picture of a person they want, or apparently just have lying around in their database. A picture of possibly 173 random brown people that the CIA decided they'd fuck up their life with. Then, a $5,000 bounty is posted underneath, kind of like a messed up One Piece. Once the pamphlets were thrown together in Photoshop, they were printed and dropped in Middle Eastern towns. This would inspire the Pakistani army to start transferring over prisoners en masse. Currently, as of today, 2023, there are 30 people in Guantanamo Bay, with approximately half of them never to be released or transferred, as being too dangerous to do so. Execute Americans, not terrorists. Got it. Some notable members, and I'm gonna mess up these pronunciations, are Ramzi bin al-Shibh, who was pretty involved in the 9/11 attacks, organizing information and deciphering code, Mustafa al-Hawasi, who who financed or acted as a money manager for the 9/11 attacks, and Ammar al-Baluchi, who did a lot of the legwork and acted as the face for the US-based al-Qaeda operations when picking up money. In a lot of ways, the people in the prison deserve the hell on earth man has created, waking up every day to be beat with hoses and waterboarded till the sun goes down, all just to do it again the next day. But what about those people who were innocent? You ever hear about Mexican Joker from South Park?
You're traumatizing them and teaching them to fear the US government.
Correct.
Okay, let me try to put this in terms you people will understand. You know superhero movies, right?
Yeah.
Okay, you remember how they always create the villain? Some random person who, when they were a child, got taken from their parents and locked away? And the kid was just left to sit and plan revenge? What you're doing here is creating a Mexican Joker.
This right here is how these terrorists are created. Black sites, like I said, are old news. More recently, the CIA had their tools of the trade leaked on WikiLeaks in 2017. Over 8,000 documents were uploaded detailing the CIA's capabilities of doing, like, watchdog type stuff, like shutting down cars and compromising any mobile device and operating systems. In my opinion, this is pretty obvious. However, at the time, Mike Pompeo, director of the CIA, was pretty salty, calling WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence service. Scathing. If you can't already tell, the CIA has some selective filters when it comes to picking who are and who are not terrorists. Sit back and get comfortable because you have no idea. Everyone knows about the Iran-Contra affair, and if you don't know where he's basically Reagan, the president, and North, the colonel, sold arms to Iran, the country, and gave the money to a death squad by the name of the Contras in Nicaragua, another country. The Contras were a right-wing militant group fighting the left-wing commanding communist militant group established by the Soviets, also by the name of the Sandinistas. In short, the US used to run the country of Nicaragua from like 1910 to 1930, while the Panama Canal was being built. Why this country in particular? Well, to prevent Nicaragua from doing the same thing as Panama, the US wanted the only canal. After the US finished their occupation, they left the country in control of Anastasio Somoza Garcia, a president/dictator, but we only say president because the US only calls presidents to dictators when they're communist. People didn't like the current president regime as his sons kept taking power, so the Sandinistas, a socialist party, supposedly another opposite political ideology of America, start the Nicaraguan Revolution in 1961. They win and gain some influence. Huzzah. Though it's been heavily disputed, it's allegedly believed that the US created the Contras by spreading propaganda with the artificial pumping of unease. It's been denied by the US every time by officials, but the positive relationship that we shared is undeniable. Personally, I believe the US did create the Contras because it wouldn't be out of the playbook for the CIA to overthrow democratically elected officials through artificially organized coups. The ideas of communists being so close to us didn't sit well with Reagan, and he wanted to do something about it. In my humble opinion, the presidents of the years 1951 to 1999 were all playing a game of whack-a-mole with communism. Here's the thing, the USSR, or Russia at the time, was crazy communist after the Russian Revolution of 1917, as the Bolshevik Reds versus the Tsarist Whites turned the whole nation upside down. The age of Stalin has passed, and a series of middlemen leading to Gorbachev were in charge at the time. Unlike Gorbachev, the middlemen were super pro-Stalin policies. This essentially meant creating satellite states, but with all the easy prey taken in Europe, South America was next. Reagan was seething at this. Unfortunately for him, the Boland Amendment had been passed in 1982, specifically forbidding the support of the Contras to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. Rats. Iran had an arms embargo against it. Why? Well, in the Middle East, there are two major sides, Iran and Saudi Arabia. Both are very similar, hence why they hate each other, kind of like the US with Russia, outside looking in. The US picked Saudi Arabia for whatever reason, Saudi Arabia probably with a more stable climate, versus Iran, where they had a series of government changes sometimes spanning from the US's actions in the Middle East. Additionally, it would be Iran that currently has a closer origin story to America, which never really rubs America the right way. In 1905, the Iranian constitutional revolution would occur, creating a democratic style of government. However, due to a famine, the Persian coup of 1921 would go down, placing Reza Shah in power in 1925 till the 1940s. During this time, World War II would pop off and England and Soviet Russia, on the same side, occupy the recently changed nation of Persia, knowing it now as Iran. They did this because money and Britain at the same time had all ownership of oil in Iran, which is insane. World War II ends and Mohammad Mossadegh is made prime minister. Following the election, Mossadegh nationalizes Iran's oil rights. If it's one thing you don't do, it's touch the white man's oil. So following this, the US specifically, the CIA, and I guess England, help in a group project kind of way to do the next logical thing. They overthrow a democratically elected official, inadvertently causing the death of hundreds of millions. Drop the CIA in Iran with a budget, a dab pen, and a Hellcat, and you'll get a new government by the end of it. Agents would hire the most dangerous mobsters in Tehran, paying them to go create mobs in favor of the recently removed Shah. Hell, the CIA would carpool people just to these events in vans with juice boxes and orange slices. Mossadegh would be removed from office following the Iranian coup of 1953, where he would die no later than 5 years after his arrest under cruel conditions. In his place, the US would put Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, I think is how you say it, as Shah Reza. Reza would continue to westernize the country at an aggressive rate, so aggressive in fact that the traditional conservative Muslim population didn't want any of that jazz. So, enter a familiar name. Ayatollah Khomeini, a political rights activist, starts to organize from 1963 to 1979, starting the Islamic Revolution and overtaking the Pahlavi dynasty and taking power as leader. During this period of time, American civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr. would also stage his own movement for the equal treatment of races. King would sadly pass after an assassin shot him in Tennessee at a Memphis hotel in 1968. It's a common conspiracy that the CIA are to blame for the death of MLK. However, no substantial evidence has been provided for this claim. What has been provided is a falsified joint op by the FBI and CIA that has not been redacted in any way, trying to insinuate Dr. King was a wife-beating alcoholic. It is interesting to think about because no one shot the Ayatollah, and he ended up changing Iran to this day. Anyways, this would send shockwaves across the Middle East, as for some reason, this revolution over any other in Iran really shook up the Saudis' faith in their own regime. Additionally, the Ayatollah represented a primary Shia sect of Islam, which has long had a divided but traditionally peaceful history from the Saudi Sunni sect. It didn't help either that the revolution was religiously motivated, giving the Ayatollah a claim that Iran was in fact the true Muslim Holy Land over Saudi Arabia. A primary difference between the Sunni and Shia sect of Islam is who the Prophet Muhammad's disciple was, if he even had one. The claim that the Saudi Arabia is the Holy Land of Muslims stems from the locations of two cities, Medina and Mecca. Medina being from where the Prophet Muhammad started to grow Islam and where the Holy Blackstone was placed uniting the surrounding tribes. Mecca is where Muhammad the Prophet is from. The Ayatollah would continue his revolution not recognizing the national borders by spreading support to specifically Shia groups in other countries, like Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq, under the rule of Saddam Hussein at the time, didn't like this and also saw the opportunity for growth. Hussein would declare war with Iran in 1980, trying to expand. Iraq would start losing this whole thing. Surprising enough, Saddam should have just used those weapons of mass destruction he had. Saudi Arabia would step in and start supporting Iraq against Iran. This would continue to fizzle for about a decade until the US stepped in 2003, high on its war on terror. The reason for doing so was the US did think Iraq possibly had nukes or was making them, and that Al-Qaeda had shown a presence in the region. Cutting back to Reagan at the 1984 election where the Sandinistas held power, things sort of sizzle out with peace talks held soon after, and South America was no longer the talk of the town for the big girls upstairs. The CIA has been caught doing a lot of not so great things, some might say far worse than killing your mom, but what's important is that it was all to keep America safe. Supposedly. I've got some new merch up on my website. I don't really expect anyone to get it, especially at 1,000 subs, so, but I figured I'd let people know. It's important to plug yourself. Plug yourself on your own content. Why not? Yeah, and if you guys could watch this 4 times each, then I would be able to monetize, which would be cool. I don't know how much money I'd make, but it'd be cool to monetize, because then people could donate during streams, and maybe that'd make me stream more. I don't know, either way, please enjoy this Wendigoon clip as I say peace.
Remember, kids, the next time that somebody tells you the government wouldn't do that, oh yes they would.